Cool. Well, thank you everyone for coming along this afternoon. I know we're getting towards the end of the conference, so I appreciate you all kind of sticking around today, particularly of those of you who partaked last night in the big dinner and any drinking as well. So thank you all for sticking around. Now, the title of this talk's a little bit of a mouthful, so let me give you a little bit of backstory first. As was mentioned, my name's Josh Lemon. I currently work for Uptycs, and I run their managed detection and response team across the globe. I'm also a SANS author for the Cloud Forensics class, and thanks again for those of you. I can see a couple of faces that came along to the workshop earlier this week as well. Nice. And then I also teach the advanced forensics for Windows and advanced network forensics as well. But in my background, I've also done things like worked inside of CSIRTs inside of organisations. So I've worked in financial organisations and I've worked in some really large US tech companies as well. And I've worked in those at the capacity as a manager for a CSIRT or director for their CSIRT. And one of the challenges that I kind of used to find as part of that, particularly running the CSIRT team, which were the team trying to do incident response and forensics, and then also do things like taking alerts and triage those alerts, is there is this big challenge, particularly in organisations where you have teams that write detection rules, which are separate to teams that do incident response and forensics. And the big thing that I always used to be concerned about was, all right, which alert that we're looking at is actually going to result in us getting compromised? Which alert is it that I need to look at now because it is the start of a compromise occurring, or we are moments away from a compromise actually occurring inside the organisation? And that was one of the things that used to kind of keep me up at night as a CSIRT director, is that basically, if I've got these alerts and detections coming in, are my team getting or looking at the useful alerts or the important alerts first? And then kind of a secondary component to that as well was, all right, how can I teach or how can I help the detection team write better detections? Because it's one thing for me to kind of stand up here and kind of throw rocks at the detection team, but that's not useful. I also wanted a way to be able to say, all right, detection team, I need you to go and cut rules that look like this, or I need you to cut rules that detect these types of things. And one of the things that our industry has done for probably a good 5 years now is they've focused really, really heavily on things like the MITRE ATT&CK framework. I know a number of organisations, even when I was doing consulting, you'd go in and talk to them and you'd be like, all right, what detections do you have? How do you kind of go about doing this? And people would look at that and go, all right, well, we look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework and we kind of pick those off and we look at how many of those we have covered and how many we don't have covered. And then we throw those as alerts over to our incident response team or our IR or forensics team, and then they have to go and deal with them at that point. And that's all well and good. The MITRE ATT&CK framework's a really good way of kind of looking at current actions that threats take inside an environment. But that, when you kind of throw one of those alerts to your SOC or to your CSIRT team, that doesn't necessarily mean that that is the most important thing they need to look at. And I wanted to try to find a way that we could kind of take existing frameworks and make this simple. A lot of this actually based around things like the TLP scheme that we have at the moment, where it's nice and simple, or relatively simple compared to other schemes. And I wanted to go, all right, how can I find this framework, or how can I kind of go, these are super important and these are not important, and have that easily read by the detection team or understood by the detection team, and also by my SOC or my CSIRT team as well. So I thought, you know what, let's take a couple of stock standard alerts, which I know are really bad and I know are really boring. So I took things like external port scan. Now, when that gets thrown to my CSIRT team, not super useful. But when someone throws something like a Mimikatz detection, hey, that's actually pretty interesting. And that's probably a sign of bad things about to occur inside the environment. So for those of you here in the room, you kind of look at this and go, well, that's kind of pretty easy to kind of understand why that might be bad or why that might not be bad. But I wanted to find a way to better represent that and look at some of the frameworks we already have to see if there's kind of interesting correlations of events or interesting correlations of how these kind of all match together. So if I took something like the kill chain to start with, and I went, all right, external port scan on the kill chain, that sits back in recon. And I went, all right, Mimikatz, that sits over here in actions on objectives. I'm like, all right, cool, interesting. They're kind of at opposite ends of the kill chain. Kind of makes sense why Mimikatz might be much worse than something like an external port scan. I said, okay, this is interesting, but let's look at other frameworks as well. Like, how does this map to things like MITRE? If I took the same two detections and then looked at this just against the MITRE tactics to start with, not all the techniques underneath each tactic, and I went, all right, external port scan, again, that sits up inside of recon. But when I look at something like Mimikatz, okay, that doesn't sit at the end of the MITRE tactics when I kind of look at them, and I've had to kind of split them on the screen so they're easy to see here. But Mimikatz doesn't sit right at the end. It actually sits sort of in the middle, and also it sits across two tactics. I was like, okay, that's kind of interesting as well. I was like, all right, let's kind of repeat this exercise and see what happens again. So this time around, if I took something like a phishing link detection or Cobalt Strike, so with a show of hands in the room, who wants to look at the phishing link first? Who wants to look at the Cobalt Strike detection first? Yeah, okay. And that's the thing, like I did see someone put their hand up for phishing link, which is okay, and there's various reasons for it. But if these were the two alerts on your screen and you had to pick one of these to look at, we all kind of intuitively know Cobalt Strike is all kinds of bad. So again, phishing link, that sits in delivery, where the detection kind of sits for it. But Cobalt Strike, again, that sits at the end of the kill chain and actually sits across multiple actions inside of the kill chain. Same task again, if I took these and then mapped these back to MITRE just at the tactics for this point, I could do things like go, all right, well, phishing link sits inside of initial access, trying to basically get initial access into the environment, and Cobalt Strike sits across stacks of the tactics inside of MITRE attack. Okay, that makes more sense. But again, these are kind of simple ones that we all as sort of seasoned incident responders kind of intuitively know. What if we took something a little bit different? What if we actually took our Cobalt Strike and Mimikatz this time? So again, show of hands, who wants to look at Cobalt, if these were the only two things that you had on your dashboard, who wants to look at Cobalt Strike first? Okay, and who wants to look at Mimikatz first? Okay, so probably a third of the room went for Mimikatz and about half went for Cobalt Strike, and the others were kind of sitting back and watching, which is cool too. So if we took Cobalt Strike and we map that, we've got our 3 at the end there, and then when we look at Mimikatz, we've got 1 at the end there. Now, given that people kind of started to intuitively, well, let's say the group in the room here kind of went, Cobalt Strike as a whole seems a bit more interesting. And again, we're seeing that spread across multiple stages of that kill chain. Again, if we did the same thing and map this back to MITRE, we start to see things like Cobalt Strike have a number of them, and then Mimikatz have only 2 tactics inside of the MITRE attack tactics as part of this. I was like, all right, this is kind of interesting. Maybe I can start to kind of write some of these up. But there was something missing from this, and that's things like our proxy shell or our log4j or our MoveIts, which is kind of the new hotness at the moment in the media. How do we deal with those? Because they're a little bit different. They're not kind of the specific tactics that we see all the time. They're kind of these one-off things that come along every now and then and kind of give us lots of anxiety or lots of sleepless nights. So how do we deal with those? So if I again, it's kind of a little bit out of order. That's all right. So let's say, for example, I had those 4 alerts. I'll come back to the vulnerability in a minute. We had those 4 alerts. I've got my external port scan. I've got my phishing link. And I've then got things like Mimikatz, which has those 2 tactics in the MITRE attack framework. And then I've got my Cobalt Strike, which falls across multiple stages in the kill chain, and again, a number of tactics as well. So I can start to see some interesting kind of correlation that's starting to occur here, where things at the start of the kill chain or start of the MITRE attack tactics are kind of less interesting. Things towards the end seem more interesting. Things that span multiples, again, are more interesting to me as a likely incident about to occur. And remember, that's the original thing I'm going back to. As an incident responder, what do I want to pick up first to prevent an incident occurring inside the environment? Now, everything I've kind of talked about so far excludes things like intel gathering. Yes, things like phishing links are super interesting from an intel perspective as well, but that's not what I was looking at. I wanted to basically know my IR team or my SOC team, how do we stop an incident from occurring today? How do I know that they've picked up the right detection and there's not one sort of laying further down in my list of detections or my queue that actually is currently causing lots of issues? All right, so let's go back to the vulnerability side of things. Oh, no, let's not do that. Let's keep going along this slide for a minute. So I've got my kill chain, and I know the start of the kill chain is not too bad, but potentially the start of an incident, and the end of the kill chain is much, much worse. But also I know that multiple things in the kill chain mean bad things are likely occurring. And the same with MITRE ATT&CK. If I've got MITRE ATT&CK and there's just one tactic occurring, that may not be super interesting. So someone's got like a detection for, let's say, a new service getting installed, which is inside of things like my persistence tactic. That on its own is not super interesting. I mean, it could be, but on its own, it doesn't kind of show me progression of a potential attack occurring. So when I start to see multiple tactics occur together, things could be potentially quite bad, along with also moving further towards the end of the MITRE ATT&CK tactics that we see. All right, now let's do vulnerabilities. No, let's not. Let's look at techniques inside of those tactics. So again, I kind of gave you the example of something like a service account, or let's say, for example, a service getting created inside of a host. Now, again, that on its own, not super interesting. But if I also see things like multiple techniques under one tactic occur, that could be more interesting. So even though I might have detection or a threat doing something inside of one tactic, when they start to kind of hit multiple techniques under that tactic, things start to become more interesting because maybe a threat actor's kind of gotten stuck, or maybe they're doing multiple persistence techniques. Maybe they're doing things like a scheduled task as well as installing a service inside of a system, as well as doing things like creating or modifying accounts on that system as well. Like that starts to show me, even though they're inside of that one tactic, that potentially they are doing multiple things of evil, which again is kind of the start of a potential incident that I need to look at. Okay, the vulnerability side of it. If we took something like Log4j, and we had the Log4j exploit attempt kind of get thrown on our IDS system, what do we kind of do with that? Now, again, naturally, we tend to do things like go, well, do we even have Java installed? Like, is this attempted exploitation even relevant to the location of where it's getting thrown? And a lot of the times, if it's not, then we kind of do nothing with it. Or the other thing could be, all right, we've got this detection here because the IDS has thrown it, but the IDS might not know that we actually patched that vulnerability last week. So at that point, it potentially means that I don't have an incident about to occur. Now again, from a threat intel perspective, interesting. But from an actual response and operations perspective, I don't need to burn time on this. I want to go and burn time where this occurs and it is not patched inside the environment, because that is bad. And that's when I need to start rolling my IR process as part of this. So we've got a couple of things. We know that there's correlation to things like kill chain and there's correlation to things like attack. And then we have things like vulnerabilities, where obviously we know it's important that if it's an unpatched vulnerability, things are potentially going to be bad for us as well, and we need to spend time on looking at that as well. So they're kind of where I kind of got to. And this was, again, me just looking at this going, all right, from a skilled or a knowledge perspective, what is kind of what I would normally do in my head? How do I kind of get this out onto paper and start to make this useful for other people to see? So what I tried to do was write these up. And I tried to look at this again. I've kind of given you 3 of the 5 that I actually wrote up in here. But I kind of went, all right, from a high priority alert, an alert which is a high chance going to result in an incident occurring inside the environment. If a high or critical vulnerability is detected and it's unpatched on a system, I want to look at that now. That is bad news. Or something like I have an alert that accurately detects 2 or more kill chain stages. Again, bad, because it shows me progression of a threat actor moving through their life cycle on a system or inside the environment. And the same with MITRE. If I have 2 or more attack tactics that are occurring, again, that shows me progression of a life cycle of a threat actor on an endpoint. So I kind of went, all right, if I can detect these are high. These are my really bad things that are occurring. And there are a couple of others that I started to put in here as well. Things like the one in the middle there around IOCs and TTPs. If I've got an indicator or a TTP from a previous incident, that's interesting. Because one of the things that I used to spend time doing was looking at things like nation-state threat actors. And any of you who've kind of defended against them, you know that once you kind of kick a nation-state actor out, your next task is to wait for them to come back. And so you need to watch and track those. And that's why I went, all right, look, if we've got an incident prior that has occurred, we need to basically use that. I mean, it's essentially intel. We need to use our own intel to track that as well. And then the one at the top there was more around trying to do things like track high confidence intel for sort of known groups or known threat actors that would come into the environment as well. Okay, so that's kind of where I got to with the high side. I went, all right, well, how do we break this down into medium? So we know if we have things like an alert that detects 2 or more techniques, and remember the techniques are inside of our tactic. So it kind of indicates not necessarily progression in the life cycle of a threat actor, but it shows me that a threat actor might be potentially trying to do multiple things inside of one tactic, which are all those kind of techniques and then sub-techniques as well. So if I can see 2 or more of those, I potentially have bad things. Might not always be bad, but it's something that's worth looking at. Definitely more interesting to see 2 of those together than just one. And then also I went, you know what, if I have, whether it's 1 or more of a detection that occurs exploitation or after in the kill chain, that's interesting too, because if a threat actor is at the stage of exploitation, it means they have kind of moved along inside the environment, or they are well towards the end of what they're doing in the environment. And us as responders, one of the big things that we're trying to prevent is actions on objectives. That's kind of when we've lost the game. It's one thing I regularly kind of tell CSIRT or IR or forensics people is if you're in that sort of SOC or IR or CSIRT role, your job is not necessarily to prevent the threat actor from getting in. Your job is to prevent actions on objectives. That's when they steal the 11 herbs and secret spices and ship them out of the environment. We want to prevent that. We want to detect them before there and get them out of the environment before they hit that actions on objectives. So that's why I kind of went, you know what, from exploitation onwards, that's bad. Like, we need to prioritize that over essentially the other end of it. And then I also did things like where we have the ability to detect a threat actor or a group who are likely to target an organisation. And that might be lower level confidence on the intel that we might have for particular indicators. And then down the bottom end of this, I went, all right, let's have a low section. And this was essentially trying to detect things that occurred delivery or prior in the kill chain. Because at that point, that's potentially the threat actor still trying to get into the environment at that point. Now, yes, that could still be bad. I agree with a lot of people that could be. But I wanted to try to find this and go, all right, how can I start to break these up to kind of tell my CSIRT or my SOC people what to look at first? And that was kind of the concept behind this. The other thing I did include in here was things like medium or low unpatched vulnerabilities, which can still be issues as well. They obviously need attention if they're kind of vulnerabilities which are unpatched inside of the environment. So that was kind of where I got to, and I produced something that looked like this. Now, the idea behind this was to try to keep it relatively simple. It wasn't to try to make it overly complex. Now, yes, there can be more nuances in this. There definitely can be, and I've had sort of a number of chats with people who've kind of talked about making this more complex. But I wanted to keep this simple so that people could take it and use it, and that was the idea behind it. The other idea behind it, as I said at the start, was to try to help detection teams. So what I really wanted to do was give this to detection teams and say, hey, detection team members, or those of you who are cutting rules, try to cut me some rules that are in the high section here. This is what I consider really, really bad. Try to go and cut me some rules or create rules that sit in this section because that's what I'm interested in. That's the threat actor getting right towards the end of actions on objectives, and I want to prevent that, so detect those earlier on. And again, I tried to keep this simple. Remember, going back to, I wanted something similar to like the TLP scheme that we have at the moment. So it was nice and kind of easy for people to take and potentially adopt if they wanted to take that further. So that was the idea behind it. But there are some gaps in this. The first big gap is that location matters. And that is because if I go back to that first alert that we looked at, Mimikatz, who wants to look at Mimikatz on an endpoint versus Mimikatz on a domain controller? Yeah, it's like, well, look, okay, Mimikatz on the domain controller, that is all kinds of bad at that point. So the current kind of matrix that I built doesn't actually account for location. And that's hard. I'd kind of shown this to a number of people and then kind of blogged about it and kind of posted a little bit about it as well and tried to get feedback from people wider in the community as well, which is partly why I wanted to present it to this group this week, is that trying to define location so it's simple, so that kind of applies generically to most people is hard. Because when I say things like a Mimikatz alert in a critical location, if I use the term critical to different people mean different things. If I talk to the CEO of a company, critical is his laptop. And you know what? Mimikatz on his laptop is not as bad as Mimikatz on a domain controller. Whereas if I talk to people who work in like legal services, a threat actor on their file server, which holds all of their information about privileged information for clients, if it's legal services, to them that is critical. So the challenge I kind of ran into was terminology of how to really define location, because it is hard to get it to a point to kind of go IT critical or system critical, and I wanted to get it to a point where it's simple for people to understand, and that's hard. That wasn't kind of an easy task to do, and that's why it's absent at the moment. But it doesn't have to be absent. What I kind of theorised with a couple of people is you could actually break up those three levels, the high, medium, low, and actually have like a super high and a high, and then a super medium and a medium, depending on location as well. And that kind of then starts to give you a bit more nuance in what you're actually looking at. The third one, which is part of the other work that I do a fair bit, is trying to adopt this to the cloud is difficult. And that's because cloud detections don't really map well to things like kill chain. I mean, which is fair, kill chain was kind of dreamt up long before we saw the prevalence of cloud at the moment. But that is really hard to kind of deal with because a lot of detections inside of the cloud are often based on looking at the timeline of detections that have occurred together. So I need to kind of think up more ways, and I'm kind of interested in hearing people's feedback on how to do that better. Because a really kind of simple detection inside of the cloud, if we kind of look at something like someone creating a snapshot of a running virtual machine, they store the snapshot, then they change the permissions on the snapshot, but those permissions are for an external account, that's bad. But those are bad in sequence together. And that doesn't really map back to kill chain, which then also makes it hard to kind of map into the matrix that I kind of built there. So I'm kind of keen to hear how other people might think that could work or how we could kind of map it back in together. And then the last one is that everything I've kind of said sounds super good in theory, but is hard in practice. In fact, it's very hard in practice because it is heavily reliant on how you generate detections to start with, and then also how you hand those detections to the SOC team. Now, the SOC team can kind of do this mentally in their head, and they can kind of classify detections, but you kind of want to get it to a point where they don't have to, where that's all done automated. And it relies on correlation, which can be really hard, because I've really kind of thrown out the concept of other tools that I've looked at or other software packages I've looked at, and I kind of went, all right, just from a human perspective, these are the things I think are bad, and this is how we could map it together. But some people are getting better at this. Like I know there are vendors now who will do things like go, you know what, I can see a detection for log4j, and I can query the endpoint, and I can see there is Java installed, and it is unpatched. So all that together is really bad. So vendors are slowly starting to go down that direction, which is great for us as ops people. But trying to correlate some of the other things like kill chain and MITRE can be hard. I do like that a lot of vendors now are mapping back to MITRE, which is the start of this, but then you've got to correlate them together as well. So that's kind of where I got to. And the other idea of trying to present this was to share it with the community, but also in the hope that the community would pick it up and start to use it or start to build on it as well. I know in some of the earlier talks I saw this week was kind of a request for like an operations SIG or a security operations SIG. And the idea is that someone would kind of take this and sort of build on this and then start to mature it and kind of put it to a point where vendors and operations teams start to use it more or can leverage it for their own purposes inside their environment. So that's my kind of gift for you today to take away and have a look at this. I have put up here a link to a blog where I basically wrote up some of this detail, but the matrix, which I saw a lot of you kind of take photos of, the matrix is sitting there in its whole form if you kind of want to take that and use it or leverage it. But my ask is share this, but also share back to me and let me know what does work and what doesn't work, so that we can do things like build this out better and start to kind of come up with this common standard of interesting detections and alerts from an IR perspective so that we can start to help our security teams better catch threat actors before they achieve their actions on objectives. That's all from me. Thank you very much. I think we kind of got 5 minutes for questions, so feel free to jump up at a mic. Not quite yet. Give him a second.
Hello?
Hey.
Yeah. Hi, George. Quick question about the prioritization. So considering here threat agents, threat actors, what about non-targeted, like for Log4j, it was massively spread and without focusing on a specific company, so.
And that's why, so for things like widespread compromise, so things like Log4j or Move It, which we're kind of seeing now, which is kind of largely been, or suspected of being Clop and potentially a couple of others, that's kind of why I looked at vulnerabilities separate to this as well, and why I didn't kind of go, like, let's take sort of threat intel as a big component of it. I basically wanted to look at it and go, all right, what's the potential stage of exploitation occurring? And start to look at those. But that was the idea behind sort of separating out vulnerabilities. And that's kind of why I say, like if there's a high or critical vulnerability that's unpatched, that should be in that high category as part of it. But that was the intent of trying to kind of catch that side of it.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
That's all right.
Hi. I have two things, I guess, kind of a thought/comment and then a question. So for the thought comment, so on your priority list there where you were talking about location versus severity, I'd assert that it's not really location. You're talking about risk. It's risk to the business, and location is one aspect of risk, and then there's a whole slew of others, right? So it's kind of like the way that I talk about it a lot is there's priority and there's risk, and you got to tie them together, right? So that's just a comment. Like to me, it's not just location.
Correct.
And then the question is, so the alerts that can detect two or more tactics, like I'm just, because you then, I think I kind of picked it up because then you did talk about correlation. Are you talking about, because normally an alert would detect a tactic, and then you could correlate multiple chains of alerts together and then have another alert that's made up of those alerts. Is that what you're talking about here? Or like is it about prioritizing the correlated chain of alerts?
Correct, yeah. I've tried not to, yes, I mean, essentially yes, to the second question is basically, I want, as a security operations person, I want to see a detection or an alert, whatever kind of terminology you want to use, that shows me multiple tactics occurring together from the same origin and presented to me to kind of go, all right, I can see potentially a threat actor performing multiple things inside of the MITRE attack matrix or along sort of the kill chain. So yeah, the idea is to kind of have those correlated together. You are right, there is still the need to do things like detect them individually as a starting point to begin with, but then to essentially have them correlated as they get handed over to your security ops person. Because again, the challenge that I've seen in practice is, I've been in SOCs where they will do individual alerts for every technique inside of MITRE, and then they rely on the ops person to basically cross-correlate those together. But you know, if someone installed a service kind of 30 minutes ago and now they're doing things like laterally moving to another system, and that kind of took them 30 minutes to figure out how to do that, those detections could be like a scroll screen apart in a queue. And what I was trying to do is get it to a point where those are correlated together and handed as one item, or even kind of re-correlated if they occur a long way apart, so that the ops person kind of goes, all right, this is now being reclassified and this is really bad and we need to do something about it.
Yeah, like, so this idea, it's really aligned with, you know, one of the things that I was trying to push with attack flow, right, is when you build an attack flow, to be able to leverage it for detection, and the further in the flow you progress, the increased risk, right? So you can kind of imagine your rules have a counter, and as you go through, so I detected this, it increases by 2. If I detect that, it'll increase by 5, and then you actually only trip the alert, the end alert, if the risk is greater than whatever your threshold is, right?
Yeah, that's
then
exactly
you have all
right.
these atomic detections, but then your SOC team only looks for the correlated things that are high risk, right?
Yeah, and that's why I say like that's hard. Like correlation is not simple because it could be seconds apart, it could be like a number of minutes apart. The other thing too that you mentioned at the start, the comment around risk and location, I completely agree. But I still found, and I mean, I'm keen to kind of hear if you have other thoughts, but I still found that saying to someone, if an alert occurs in a high risk place or at a place where there is high risk to the organisation, I found it challenging to find how people interpreted that. Like if I talk to risk people inside of financial institutions, they look at risk very differently to what we do as sort of security people.
Yeah.
But finding the right terminology
really
is hard
tricky.
for that,
It's really tricky too, because sometimes the risk, it's because of what that asset is currently being used for at that current point in time.
Correct, yeah.
Right? So, Anyway,
Yeah, cool.
hogging the mic.
That's
all right.
Cool, thank you very much.
So maybe building to that thought, right? So my thinking was, why are you not using a score-based system and rather have those terms, right? Because then you could potentially multiply with a location factor or a risk-based factor. And I mean, as a representation, I think this is easier for a SOC analyst, right?
Yeah.
But as a representation layer, you can then say like, okay, if the score is above that, then it's like of a high priority to the SOC or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And the idea was to kind of give this so people who had different SORs could create this inside of their own environment. That was I wanted to find something that was generic enough to kind of work with that.
Okay, and then my question actually was, do you also think that these categories do have some implication for automation? So for example, that maybe, if I now look at it, right, maybe you would rather stick to the low alerts and try to automate those first, because for the high alerts, you want a human analyst to look at stuff, right? So have you also played with that thought or some experience or perspective to share?
I hadn't given that much thought to kind of this framework, but yes, you could definitely do that. You could have it go through and kind of and add like automation for SOAR systems to things like low alerts, but you would have to consider like the risk stuff that we were talking about before. Like if you have a detection that's low on a high risk asset and you kind of automate some sort of preventative measure, you could kind of end up in a bit of trouble with that. And that's kind of my issue around finding the right words for risk or location as part of it. I'm kind of getting it's time from down the front here, but I'll hang around and answer questions as well. But feel free to reach out to me if you've got any ideas or how we can kind of improve this framework. feel free to reach out to me because I'm kind of keen to hear this from the community and also for the community to kind of take it and start to leverage it more. Thank you all very much.
A quick round of applause for Josh. Thank you.